Hi, The Address is a beautiful short story by the author Marga Minko. Marga Minko is the pen name of Sarah Menko. In 1942, her parents were forced to move into the city's Jewish quarter. The parents, her brother and sister were all deported, and Marga, Sarah, managed to survive the war in hiding. Thus, her stories often revolve around the existential problems often faced by survivors. The characters in the story they address are the narrator Marga Minko, Mrs. S, the mother of the narrator, Mrs. Darling, an acquaintance of the narrator's mother. Acquaintance is a person who is known, who is very much attached to somebody. A girl of 15, daughter of Mrs. Darling. When we read the synopsis of the story, then we come to know that the narrator arrives at 46 Marconi Street, a house owned by certain Mrs. Darling. The door is opened a mere inch by a woman who seems not to know the narrator and treats her with cool incivility. However, during the course of interaction, three important realizations occur. The narrator realizes that she is at the correct address as Mrs. Darling is wearing her mother's sweater. From the faded buttons, it is evident that the sweater has been worn fairly often. The narrator knows she is unwelcome as Mrs. Darling does not even let the narrator come into the house. The narrator goes away disappointed and unsuccessful in collecting her things. The narrator hears a door open and close within the house behind Mrs. Darling. The readers know then that there is another person in the house, someone whom Mrs. Darling is anxious to keep away from the narrator. As the narrator walks back to the train station, she recalls how once on returning home from the university during the first half of the World War II, she had found several of their household items missing. Her mother had then informed her that Mrs. Darling, an old acquaintance of her mother's, had renewed their contact and insisted that she, means Mrs. Darling, keep their things safe during the war. The narrator also recalls another incident when she had seen Mrs. Darling for an instant in a brown coat and shapeless hat before the woman left with yet another installment of the narrator's things. The narrator's mother, an apparently gullible woman, did not seem to suspect Mrs. Darling of any ulterior motive. Mrs. S, the narrator's woman, was more worried about Mrs. Darling hurting herself or being attacked by someone while carrying their things back to Marconi Street for safekeeping. She asked her daughter to remember Mrs. Darling's address in case the narrator was the only one who survived the war. After the first unsuccessful visit, the narrator ruminates about why she took so long to return for her mother's things. The war and the loss of her family had settled heavily on the narrator's heart. She only felt fear and hesitation when she thought about things kept at Mrs. Darling's house. Each of those things carried memories of her life before the war. The pain of loss stopped her from returning for her things sooner. The impact of war on civilians has been portrayed in several books and movies, including The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank, Sarah's Key by Tatiana de Rosnay, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne, and movies such as Schindler's List, The Torture of the Concentration Camps. The loss of loved ones left a painful, everlasting impact. The narrator's observation of the light-colored bread, familiar views, and unthreatened sleep implies the coarse, stale food of the camps, the view of barren land and barbed wires, and a sleep forever threatened with pain and death. You can see the disasters of war in this picture, how the people are behind the wars, and so much of usage of armaments and the dead bodies of the people, and so much of devastation, scarcity of food, etc. After the first failed attempt, the narrator tried to visit Mrs. Darling again. This time the woman was not at home and she was greeted by her 15-year-old daughter. The girl showed off the antiques in her house to the narrator, oblivious to the fact that they had once belonged to the narrator's own home. When the narrator finds that her things had now become a part of someone else's life and memories, she decides not to take her things after all. The memories associated with her things were overwhelming. There was no space for such fancy items in the small room where she lived now. Everything was now a part of someone else's home and life, creating new memories each day. The visit was actually successful in the sense that the narrator was finally able to find the strength to move on and felt that of all the memories left behind the war, the address with her mother's old things would be the easiest to forget. So the story of the address is the story of human predicament that follows the war. This can be a value-based question asked, very important question, which can come in the examination, because the wars always bring death and destruction. Wars cannot end conflict. In Holland, a Jew family had suffered, that is Mrs. S and her daughter, and as Mrs. S was feeling that Mrs. Darling could keep her things safe, so that is why she gave the valuable items from her house to Mrs. Darling to keep safe. But after the war, Mrs. Darling, she does not even recognize Mrs. S's daughter. She is reluctant to even allow her to enter the house when she reaches the number 46 Marconi Street. This is the address. When she reaches her house, Mrs. Darling does not allow her to enter the house. She shows that she is very busy. Okay. Mrs. S died. She shows her uncharitable nature. This is very wrong. It is not a good sign of her character. But Mrs. Darling daughter is different from her. On the second visit of the narrator, she meets Mrs. Darling's daughter. Mrs. Darling's daughter invites her inside. She tells her to wait because Mrs. Darling was not at home. But the narrator realizes that she should not take all the belongings of her mother, because now all the belongings belong to somebody else and they were all discarded and kept just like that. So much of dust was there on the things. It was not taken care of properly the way her mother used to do. So she realized that now there is no use of taking back all those things. The address is a story of human predicament that follows war. What does this mean? It means that after a certain period of time, the person forgets the loss which he had. Though the loss of human beings can never be patched up, but every person gets settled. Every person needs time to forget all those sufferings, all those losses which he had. Same way, the story of the address. Here, the narrator, she feels that the time which she had spent with her mother is more valuable. Those memories are invaluable She can never forget those. So, those memories are rather more precious than all these materialistic things. So, thank